Hello, my name is Michaël Green. I'm professor at the University of Łódź in Poland, and I welcome you to the 10th episode of my podcast, Historians in Conversation. My guest today is Professor Jessica Roitman from the Vrije University in Amsterdam, and I had the opportunity to meet her in person to record this podcast right after her inauguration in Amsterdam. Jessica Roitman is a scholar of Jewish studies, and she has been working in various universities in the Netherlands. Her research focuses not only on Dutch Jewry, but also on Dutch Jewry overseas, and in particular in the various Dutch colonies. I welcome Jessica to my podcast, and I hope that you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Jessica, and welcome to my podcast. I'm very happy that you agreed to participate in my podcast, which is the 10th today.
Oh, wow.
And I'm very glad that we are also taking this conversation in person.
Yeah, well, I've been enjoying your podcasts, and I think it's a great way to bring the work we as historians do, hopefully to a broader public or to historians who might not know what we do.
You have been recently appointed as Professor of Jewish Studies at the Vrije University of Amsterdam. So first of all, I would like to congratulate you on this very important achievement.
Thank you.
I've been to your lecture and I recommend everyone to watch it because I found it fascinating. You can watch this lecture on the Vrije University's website and also in the description that will be provided below this podcast.
Thank you.
But I would like to come back to the very early stage of your life, to your
Sure.
childhood. And I always ask my guests about their background. So can you tell a little bit where do you come from?
So I was born and raised in Richmond, Kentucky. That's a town when I was growing up, about 25,000 people. It's larger now. It's in the American Bible Belt. My dad was a professor at Eastern Kentucky University, which was the university that was there. That's why my family was there. There were about 6 or 7 other Jewish families there. We were almost all associated with the university. There were 2 synagogues about 40 miles away, or 40 kilometers, about 30 miles away in Lexington, Kentucky, a conservative and a reform congregation, although the conservative wasn't particularly conservative. My family were members of Temple Adath Israel, which was a reform congregation.
And so your father was a university professor already at the time?
He was a professor of American history.
So also a historian.
Also a historian. It runs in the family, definitely.
Do you remember as a child if you were already interested in history?
I always loved history. I was always fascinated with history. My mother had also studied art history and archaeology. So it was basically, there was no other choice but to be interested in history. We would go to the western part of the U.S. every summer, camping and visiting archaeological sites, historical sites. So I don't ever remember a time when I didn't think historically or when I wasn't interested in history. What's interested me in history has changed over the years. It's developed over the years. The way I think about history's changed, but that's always been there.
Do you remember as a child if you liked some particular books? Because some of the people to whom I spoke previously said that one of the motivations to study history was interest in, for example, in Dumas or in Lord of the Rings or
Right.
in anything similar to that?
I think so much of my interest in history came from my family, that I'm not sure it was really inspired by any books. I liked the Laura Ingalls Wilder Little House on the Prairie books, which are very well-known American children's books about the so-called pioneers who went to the western part of the U.S.
I read them. Those books.
Yeah, so I liked those, but they didn't inspire my history or my love of history. I also loved Nancy Drew books, which were just mystery books for young kids. I read a lot. I still read a lot, but no, it really wasn't any book that I read.
And your father and mother, did they bring work home? So was it something that they discussed over the dinner table or Shabbat table? Some findings that they had or some...
No, I mean, my dad brought work home in the sense that he would grade papers at home, something like that, but not really. No, I I would say that most of what I heard about certainly the university life that I heard at home, also because so many of their friends were affiliated, basically all their friends were in some way affiliated with the university, maybe not as historians, but other departments, was how horrible the students were, how horrible the administration was, the decline of, and keep in mind this is in the 70s and 80s. Yeah, how the quality of students had gone down and how bad university administration was, etc. Of course, those are the same complaints that we now as academics are making, decrying the students' administration. So nothing changes, but it obviously didn't deter me from going into this life.
So at what point did you decide that you want to, not only that you're interested in history, but you actually want to make a profession out of it? Was it already when you were at school or at a later stage?
So I've had a very much a push-pull relationship with academia my whole life, having grown up in it. I would decide I wanted to be an academic, then I didn't. So my trajectory has certainly not been the typical Dutch one. I got my bachelor's degree in religion, and then I decided that I wanted to travel. So I went to Brazil, I taught English, I traveled around. Then I thought, yeah, I do want to go to graduate school. So I got my master's at Vanderbilt University in Latin American Studies because I loved Latin America. I'd been in Brazil. Then I decided, oh no, academia is really, really not for me. I traveled, I worked, I did other things, and then I finally decided, oh yes, actually academia research is what I want. And that's when I got my position at the University of Leiden when I was almost 32. So that wasn't still not the typical trajectory, but I'm really glad I had that push-pull relationship with academia. I'm glad I traveled. I'm glad I saw the world. I'm glad I worked in other fields, did other things, because I do think it's given me more perspective than if I'd only been in academia.
So let's go back
Okay.
in time and let's get back maybe to your final year at school. Your final year in high
Yeah.
school, prom maybe.
Yeah.
And then, well, the 17 or 18-year-old
Mhm.
Jessica
Yeah.
is facing the choice where to study,
Yeah.
that maybe what to study.
Yeah.
And how did you decide on that? What were the choices that you were facing at the time?
Well, you know a lot about the American system. So for me, it wasn't as much about what I wanted to study because I knew that, yeah, I was interested in a lot of things. At that point, I was thinking of English literature. I was thinking of history. I didn't really know. But in the American system, you do a year and a half or 2 years of general education anyway. So I wasn't very stressed about what I was going to study. Another thing that is peculiar to the American educational system, I think, is money or lack thereof. So even at the time, this is in the very late 80s, I was looking for scholarship money, and that was determining where I was going to go to university. I knew I wanted to go to a small school. So I was looking at what a small liberal arts college, which ones would give me the most scholarship money. So that really determined it. I have no regrets about going to Maryville College, a small private
college?
Maryville College in East Tennessee. At the time, about 1,200 students.
Really small.
Very small. They only at the time did bachelor's degrees. I got a great education, had fantastic teachers who were very interested in students. It was a real community. I still have friends from that time in my life. So no regrets. Although, you know, especially living in Europe, no one's heard of this. People only hear of Harvard or Princeton or something. So yeah, for me, it was really about, okay, where can I get a scholarship? And only then deciding what I wanted to major in.
And did your parents try to influence your choice of a college or a place?
Not in what I studied. I was very influenced basically by what they wished they'd had. They met at the University of Memphis, which is a much bigger school, a state school, and they both idealized the small liberal arts college. That's the sort of ivy-colored, small, not even so much elite, but the kind of community that they would have wanted. So I was very much influenced by their ideal. So I never looked at going to a bigger state school or something like that.
What I find also interesting is that you mentioned that you were looking for a scholarship, even though you were a daughter of a professor.
Well, I don't know how much you think professors make in Kentucky, but it wasn't a lot. And even then, when education in America was much cheaper than it is now, it was still quite expensive. And my parents could certainly pay for me to go to a state school, and that's again peculiar to the American system, where you you pay less tuition if you go to a school that's in the state where you're a resident. So if I'd gone to one of the Kentucky state schools, they could have paid for it. It would have been a real strain for them, especially having a younger sister who also needed to go to school, to pay the tuition for a private university, college or university. Maybe top professors at Berkeley, UCLA, Harvard, Princeton are paid very well, but most professors, especially in chronically underfunded states like Kentucky, West Virginia, Louisiana, are not paid that well.
Can you tell a little bit about the study itself? How does a liberal art college work in the States?
Yeah, so they focus on what they call the liberal arts. So those would be things like the humanities, some social sciences, hard sciences, but you wouldn't have as many courses like more vocationally or practically focused courses. Most liberal arts schools are relatively small comparatively, and most focus on getting a broader education, learning more to think, getting more experience with being part of a community, with thinking in analytical ways, and less on the actual hard skills acquired, such as, you come out of it and have a degree in nursing or accounting or something like that. The idea is more that you study more of the traditional academic fields and go on from there.
And then when you were done, you were getting a bachelor's degree, and what would be the next step?
Well, in general, people usually just go on to look for a job. I decided I wanted to travel. I had been thinking of joining the Peace Corps, which is an American program to send volunteers abroad. I'd interviewed for that. I basically just knew I wanted to travel. I didn't want to go straight on for a master's degree, and I wasn't actually particularly interested in working that much either. I wanted to work to make money to travel. So what ended up happening was I contacted a Brazilian woman I'd met when I was working on a kibbutz in Israel, when I was the summer vacation, summer break, which in America are quite long, between my second and third year of college. And we became good friends. And she had said, well, but you can live with my family and teach English, and it's fun, and why not? So that's what I ended up doing. That's how I ended up in Brazil and learning Portuguese and being able to study the Portuguese Sephardi.
Very interesting. But how did you decide then to come back? Because I think that the life in Brazil probably was rather interesting, relaxed, laid back.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I lived in Sao Paulo, which is an enormous mega city. This is even then in the mid-90s. I didn't really love Sao Paulo, with respect to all Paulistas out there listening. But I loved Brazil as a country, and I really loved Brazilians. Teaching English was fine. It was paying the bills, but I didn't love teaching English. It's one thing to speak English. It's another to be able to teach it in an effective way to people. And I think I was okay, but I wasn't a great English teacher, to be honest. And I was living with my friend's family, and they were lovely, but it would have been too expensive for me to get my own apartment, but I didn't want to keep imposing on them. And yeah, I was ready to try something else. So I came back and got into graduate school to do Latin American studies.
You got to the Vanderbilt University.
Yeah. So Vanderbilt is a pretty well-known, relatively elite American university. It was founded by Cornelius Vanderbilt, and so for the Dutch people listening to this, the last name Vanderbilt may sound familiar. Dutch ancestry. He was a so-called robber baron. This was a group of 19th century American industrialists who made lots and lots and lots of money, usually in railroads, but sometimes in oil. And unlike many of today's robber barons, very rich people, they used their money, at least part of their money, to the greater good. Not to romanticize them, but Cornelius Vanderbilt founded a university, Vanderbilt, and paid for scholarships like the one I got. Stanford, also founded by one of these people. Carnegie Mellon, also founded by Carnegie and Mellon together. Quite a few universities, some of the quite prestigious ones, were founded by these very wealthy industrialists. Also, lots of art collections, things that are open to the public. The Huntington Library, where I was lucky enough to spend a summer at doing research by Samuel Huntington. So it was a thing in the 19th century for American industrialists to found universities and cultural institutions. So Vanderbilt's a pretty big university now. They have a very well-respected, well-regarded medical center, libraries, and also quite a good Latin American studies department. At the time, just like for my bachelor's degree, and again, this is a very American thing, it came down to money. I was offered a full scholarship and a stipend at Vanderbilt to do Latin American studies. I was offered a half tuition scholarship to study religion at Harvard. So people can say, oh, but Harvard's the better known. How could you turn it down? Well, there were two reasons. The first one's money. If everything's paid for and you get a stipend to live on, so no debt to go to Vanderbilt versus having to still take out loans or work very hard to go to Harvard. For me, I thought, well, Vanderbilt. And it was also two different courses of study, and that's why I find it, life works in mysterious ways or comes full circle. I turned down that offer for a master's in religion, thinking, I really, really like religion. I like thinking about religion. I like looking at religion and history. But with the Latin American studies, I can do more things. I also love Latin America. It's more practical. And indeed, I went to work for the US government for a couple of years after that degree.
Did you learn Portuguese while being in Brazil?
Yeah. And I had minored in Spanish already, and traveled in Latin America, the Spanish-speaking Latin America. So my Spanish was okay. My Portuguese was better because I lived there for a longer time. But anyway, life's kind of interesting because I've ended up in a faculty of religion and theology after not getting those masters or PhDs in religion or theology.
I think that's just fascinating how you
Life
managed
works.
to, how life works, but also that you turned down a scholarship in Harvard. I don't think that there were many people who would have done that.
I don't know. I mean, it's not that's the thing. So even at the time, tuition was say 20,000 a year. So they gave me a scholarship for 10,000, but I'd still need to come up with another 10,000 plus live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is very expensive. So I would have had to take out still pretty big loans. And my generation of Americans, and certainly the one after mine, are burdened by massive student debt. And I think if I'd known what I know now in terms of, okay, I'm going to go on in academia, maybe I would have gone to Harvard because the name would have meant more, especially outside the US than Vanderbilt. But at the time, as I said at the beginning, I had this push-pull relationship with academia. So I thought, well, I don't know if I want to go on in academia. So the Latin American Studies degree gives me more options. Yeah.
And you actually foresaw the future because nowadays it's very important to have this broad overview and be able to do transatlantic studies.
Yeah.
And
Now it is, but at the time it worked against me. It's worked against me for a long time to say, yeah, aren't you too much of a generalist? You have a bachelor's in religion, a master's in Latin American studies, a PhD in history. What are you? Who are you? You don't have that depth of knowledge. I'm glad to hear from you that maybe times are changing and they're looking for generalists again. But it worked against me for many years.
And when you were done with Vanderbilt,
Mm.
you mentioned, well, you mentioned that you were going to work for the American government.
Mhm.
So why did you leave? Because that would be a stable job, probably with nice income, social security, pension, all the benefits.
Sometimes I've asked myself the same question, but I was a really bad civil servant.
What kind of job did you do?
Well, it was what they call program analyst, which here in the Netherlands would be a beleidsmedewerker, like just sort of general all around paper pusher. I don't know. With all due respect for all the beleidsmedewerkers who do great stuff, but the job category was kind of vague, and I just wasn't good at it. I didn't fit in the various departments where I worked. I mean, I met and had very nice colleagues, saw people who worked very hard. It just really wasn't for me, and I wasn't very good at it, and I didn't enjoy it.
So then you decided that you would do a PhD.
Yeah, well, it was a little more complicated than that. I had been traveling before the job started. I had to wait to start the job with the government. And I was traveling in Siberia, so I met Siberia on the Trans-Siberian Railway.
That was in the 90s,
That was in the 90s, yeah. And I met a Dutch guy who later became my husband. It's unfortunate we're divorcing now, but it got me to the Netherlands, and I did my PhD at the University of Leiden, and so no regrets there.
That's, again, life works in mysterious
ways, for sure.
So the choice to go to the Netherlands, it was not maybe a choice, but then Leiden as a university. Why Leiden? Why not University of Amsterdam, the Vrije Universiteit, where we are seated at the moment, or any other Dutch university?
Also maybe a bit luck. I mean, I wanted to do history. I saw something about the universities of Leiden's, what they call advanced master's degree. I don't think that exists anymore. It was designed for people like me who already had a master's and were maybe coming from abroad, or people with a Dutch master's who needed a year to prepare a PhD proposal. So I got funding to be part of that, and spent a year then developing my PhD proposal, and then it was accepted for what's called an IO, assistant in opleiding, or basically a paid or funded PhD position, and that was all at Leiden. So it was basically just because they had that program. If I'd gotten a proposal approved in Groningen or Utrecht or one of the other good universities, that would have been great too, but it just happened at Leiden.
So the decision to actually do a PhD, was it a conscious one, or it was because, you were fed up with the governmental job and then...
It was a conscious one because I'd left the government to come to the Netherlands, and then I was working for an American research company here, technology research, and that was a lot of fun. Again, people I'm still in touch with. It was a great place to sort of land when I first moved to the Netherlands. Young company, a lot of foreigners working there, not only Americans, but people from all over Europe. So it was a great social outlet for me. It was a fun job, but as I was doing it, I realized that, I loved the research part of it. I liked finding information. I liked writing about that, but I just did not care about mobile phone technology. And it really struck home to me because this was in the early days of Amazon, and we would go in together and have shipments of books to to our office, and it was all set up so we didn't have to pay international postage and whatever. So we'd all go in together as employees to order stuff. And one of my colleagues was ordering books. This is just with his own money and on his own, about visualizing technology and technology change in the future or whatever. And with my own money, with these orders, I was ordering books about the nutmeg trade and sort of accessible history books. And yeah, it really struck me. Okay, Karsten, this colleague of mine, he loves technology and he wants to read about it in his spare time, and that ties into what he's doing. And what I want to read about in my spare time has absolutely nothing to do with this. And, that's a luxury position to be in, and I don't think there's anything wrong. And I've had lots of conversations with people over the years about how good it is to leave your job at home. Like, you like your job, you're good enough at it, you go, you do it, you go home. And that's something I think we as academics, especially those of us who have a passion for our jobs, even if we wanted to, we're not able to do. It's not how it's set up. There's student papers to grade, there's emails, there's conference papers, there's something you never leave it at home. So I've come to see the value of just having a job and not being passionate about it. But that's not who I was at the time, and it's still not who I am today. So again, no regrets with that. But that at that point, I realized, let me see what options there are out there to do a PhD here in the Netherlands.
You decided to do a PhD, and it was Leiden that allowed you to do this master program. And how did you choose your supervisor?
So you needed at the time to approach a supervisor, and it's still the case. You need to have someone who's a full professor be what they call your promoter or advisor. So I was looking for someone in the history department. I wanted to do something with Brazil, trade, something like that. So I basically just looked who was working on topics and who was willing to meet with me and say they would be my advisor.
And who that eventually was?
So that was Professor Piet Immer. He's been retired now for many years, but he was a professor of what they called overseas expansion at the time at Leiden, an expert on the Dutch trade in enslaved people, Dutch Atlantic history at the time. So he was sort of now it's quite a fashionable topic, but at the time he was in his sort of niche there, and he was very willing to take me on as a student. So that's how it started, and I was happy that he was at my inaugural lecture last week.
And as a student, as a PhD student, did you already have in mind that it's actually going, or you would like it to become a career and not just a degree that you might be using afterwards to do something else? Was it something that was already in your mind then?
Absolutely.
Because if it was, then the next question is, did you take any steps as a PhD student in order to facilitate your smooth transition into the academia afterwards?
I knew by the time I started my PhD that I wanted a career out of it, because I'd already, as I've talked about, gone through this push-pull process, doing other things, traveling, and really making this decision, actually, it's academia I want. I remember when I was part of this advanced master's program, we sat at this building, I want to say it's the Nonnesteeg in Leiden, very warm building, and someone came in to tell, I think it was a group of 20 of us who were in this advanced master's program, basically to say, none of you all are going to make it, or a tiny percentage are going to make it. And he went through, okay, there's 20 of you here, and only 5 or 6 of you are going to get a paid PhD position. Now, the nice thing in the Netherlands is you can still do your PhD, and write your dissertation and whatever, but you probably still need to work unless you have a trust fund. So a lot fewer people do that, unlike in the US though, where you need to get in a program and pay tuition. So it is better, but okay, nonetheless, his point was, only 6 of you are going to get a paid position. And of those 6, only say half, so 3 are going to get a postdoc. And most of you need to get a postdoc, or and only one of you is going to get actually what we call in the US a tenure job or a VAS contract. I don't know if his stats are completely right, because strangely of my group, more of us did make it, but in that way, but the percentages are really small. So I remember sitting there, but I've read, I think it was a study out of a university in London or in the UK. I think it's called the Pablo Escobar effect. Have you read this? So it's about this idea that every drug dealer thinks that he or she's going to be Pablo Escobar, and you don't end up getting into drug dealing unless you think you're going to be Pablo Escobar. But actually, the vast majority of drug dealers end up dead or in jail or dealing on the street. So I realize that this is a possibly quite sick analogy to make with academia, but I don't think it's too far off, because it's the same effect. You can talk, and I've been asked to talk also from my very personal experience and struggles to incoming PhDs about academia and how hard it is. And I say, on one hand, well, sure, I'll do it, but first of all, I've been on that side of the table, and nothing you say or do is going to deter people who really want to do it, nor should it. If you're just interested enough in your topic, you should just pursue it. And all those people there think that they're going to be Pablo Escobar or Professor so-and-so, to use our academic analogy. No one really thinks, actually, I'm not going to make it, and I'm going to run around for a couple of years being vastly underpaid and overworked, and I'm eventually going to have to restart another career. No one thinks that or wants to think that, but that is the reality. I'm glad, though, unlike to get back to your question, when I started, there is a lot more attention to helping people working on their PhDs also develop other skills, whether to go on in academia or to find jobs, academic adjacent jobs outside academia. So I'm glad there's a lot more interest and attention for that, because it's necessary.
What do you think was the determining factor for you to get your first job after the academia, and where it was?
So I defended my
After the PhD.
So I defended my dissertation. I got a fellowship to go to the University of Pennsylvania, which was great. The Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies.
Ivy League.
That's one. Yeah. So that was nice. And I applied for a Rubicon grant, which is one of the Dutch Organization for Scientific Research, NVO, and Dutch kind of starting grants. At the time, you get money to go abroad, like a non-Dutch university for 2 years as a postdoc. So I had written a proposal, and I got it to go to Birkbeck College, University of London. So I did that for 2 years, a postdoc on Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews and interactions between them in the 18th century. So I think getting that beginning grant was what helped. But this professorship is the first permanent contract I've had, and I was actually appointed 2 years ago, but I held my lecture just recently due to COVID. And so I was appointed when I was 50. I started my PhD when I was 32. So even if we discount those years working on my PhD, I worked 4 days a week instead of 5 on it. Well, I worked like 6 days, but I was paid for 4. So I had a little more time because my son was really young. Yeah, so if we discount those years, it still was almost 15 years before I had a permanent contract. But I think that what propelled me to finally get this professorship, the permanent contract, was starting off getting that grant and then just publishing a lot.
During your oration, or the inauguration lecture, I think that's the proper English term, you mentioned that you met quite a lot of unfair things in the academia.
Yeah. And in my view.
In your view, but I think it's a topic that maybe if you are willing to we could maybe try to get a little bit more
Sure.
into, because I think that a lot of younger scholars, or maybe not so younger scholars, who are in process of getting jobs, permanent jobs or not permanent jobs, applying for grants, meet a lot of what you would call nepotism.
Yeah.
And I've heard different views about it, and some people say, well, we don't want to hire random people to be working with us because we don't know them. And if we hire someone from outside whom we don't know, we run into the risk of hiring a person who is completely unsuitable socially for this job. So that person could be perfect academically, but socially that person wouldn't fit. And we would never know it unless that person has been working with us previously. I could accept this reasoning somewhat, but it seems to me very unacademic reasoning.
I think it's not only unacademic,
or unethical.
It's
maybe.
unethical and it's unjust. And I think it's, there's a lot of talk now about diversity, equity, inclusion at universities. I'm glad there's that. I haven't necessarily seen a lot come from that yet, but maybe I'm not looking in the right places, and this isn't meant as a swipe at the people working in these offices. But I've heard that exact same thing too. The same sort of, no, but it's the social, this or that. I mean, of course, we all want good colleagues. I can imagine maybe if you're working on a project team or in a lab, it can matter more than in some other places. But I also think it's a misunderstanding of how new ideas and innovation is really created. And, there's also been lots of academic studies about tension and friction, and none of us like social tension or friction. I mean, I want to get along with my colleagues. I want things, to use the Dutch word, to be gezellig.
To be cozy.
To be cozy, to be, friendly and nice. And for me, thus far, they mostly are here. I think we all want that. I get that. But in general, innovation in whatever field comes from beliefs, from being challenged, from things, from conflict even. Now, that doesn't mean, punching each other, yelling at each other, but from differing opinions, differing ideas, things not being so friendly all the time, being challenged. That's where new ideas and innovation comes from. And if you have like super cozy little group of people, I question how much knowledge is going to be created, how much innovation, how much new is going to come from that. And as universities, as researchers, we're meant to push our respective fields, whatever they are, further. We're meant to create new knowledge. We're meant to pass that knowledge on to students. We're meant to inspire a new generation, teach them. So this idea that, it needs to be socially super, cozy, and like everything has to be gezellig, great in that way, I think is an excuse, and it's also not a way to further knowledge, and it's unethical.
Well, now you are at the position that you are going to be probably hiring new people. And I can only wish that things will change.
I hope so. I mean, I've been on hiring committees and I've seen what happens, and I've seen the tendency I feel, and I see how it works. I mean, there's very few people who go into any job thinking, I'm a sexist, racist old ass, right? None of us think that. None of us want to be that. None of us view that ourselves that way. And most people on hiring committees aren't. But I've seen for myself, being on a hiring committee, being on various ones, we do have the tendency to hire people that remind us of ourselves. And I very definitely had that, feeling really more positively inclined towards one candidate because she reminded me of myself at that age. And we were very similar, and thinking, yeah, we need to hire her. And that's fine because she was a very suitable candidate and whatever. But that showed me how important it is to have people with a variety of backgrounds. And I don't just mean quotas based on gender or race or national origin or religion or whatever, but just different backgrounds. That can be coming from a different social class. Doesn't matter, because we want to hire people that remind remind us of ourselves. And we need to balance that out. And then the people on the other side of the table, the people doing the hiring, to get more equity and inclusion in all its iterations in my case, academics, then we need to have more of those people making those decisions.
Do you think that as professor you will have the power to do so?
I
To
think
impose those principles on
absolutely not. I think the image of the all-powerful professor, and there's been Dutch literature written about this, maybe I'm just not claiming enough of my power. I don't know that it's as realistic or accurate as it once was. I think it certainly was once very accurate. There was the whole book Onder Professoren that was actually set in Groningen by a famous Dutch writer about how oppressive and powerful professors were. I certainly don't think that, well, and in fact, with good reason, a lot of those powers were stripped away over the past years, 2 decades or so. So I wouldn't overestimate my power, but I'll certainly do my best to take what I've learned from my experience and apply it.
I want to ask you another question, not related to hiring so much, but more about working in the academia. And you've been to different places and worked under different people.
Yeah.
Did you ever have a situation in which you were feeling not very good in your skin working at a specific place? You don't need to say the specific name of that university or the department. And if you did, then how did you deal with it?
So I've been really lucky to have amazing colleagues, to work in really great places in academia. I mean, there's been places I've worked where I've run up against what I mentioned in my inaugural lecture, that, I felt, and maybe it's not true, but I certainly felt that jobs were created for some people and not for others. So in that sense, I didn't feel, good in my own skin, because I felt that there was some underlying inequity, underlying injustice. But I actually really liked working, except for those quite big problems. I really had great colleagues and was challenged intellectually, and so there's never been a place I've worked in academia where I was uncomfortable, except about how these structural organizational decisions were made, which maybe sounds contradictory, but I've just been very lucky to have great colleagues and teams. The only time working in Dutch academia, and I won't say where it was, that I really just didn't like my job at all, I was actually for 2 years, because all my temporary contracts ran out, I worked in what they called academic adjacent jobs, so more administrative. I was worked as a subsidy or grant officer. So I met a lot of resistance from my colleagues, who I think felt that because I was coming in as an academic, that I thought I was superior, or they felt insecure, or I don't know. So those were pretty miserable experiences, to be honest. Not because of the work, which I actually quite liked, helping researchers with their grant proposals, with their subsidy proposals. With other academics, I had a great time. I just, unfortunately, with a few exceptions with the colleagues there, then I was, niet lekker in my vel. Like, I just didn't, feel comfortable in my own skin.
So you finally reached the goal that I think almost every person who finished the PhD is striving for.
I'm Pablo Escobar.
You are the Pablo Escobar. In our case,
I'm not bringing hippos to the canals. I'm not.
You're not driving an Uber.
That's true. I'm not. Yeah.
And because I actually met a person who was finishing habilitation in Germany, and he was very much afraid that if he doesn't get a job, the next job for him would be driving Uber.
Yeah.
So you were successful, and I would like to ask you how. Could you tell how did you reach the position of professor?
Well, I mean, I've been quite honest, and I think that, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, which is why I say it, because I'm going to use my position to make people uncomfortable, because being uncomfortable is good for us all. Um, I, it makes people feel awkward when I'm open about the fact, as I just was, that, I was in academic adjacent jobs for several years. I wasn't completely outside academia, but I wasn't working as a researcher, as a teacher, as a something, because I didn't have any more jobs. Yeah, left. I wasn't driving the Uber, but after so many years in academia, no one else, and being a certain age, no one else will hire you, as a trainee for a company or something like that. And that's the trap we can all fall into. But how I got the job, well, we can talk about my qualifications, which were, of course, excellent. I published tons. I did get grants. I had a lot of big international network. I mean, I checked all the boxes and more, if I do say so myself. As I said, which
But
again,
is it enough to check all the boxes and more?
absolutely not. It's also luck. As I said in my inaugural lecture, also to the shock of some of my colleagues, I deserve it. But a lot of us deserve it. A lot of us check all the boxes. We get the grants, we have the network, we publish our hearts out, we go to every symposium, every conference, and it still doesn't work out. This was luck. This position was funded by partially by the city of Amsterdam with reparation payments. The Vrije University had wanted someone in Jewish studies for a really long time. So things came together with this position, but they could very, very easily not have. So yeah, I worked myself to death, kind of. I did all the things, but there was also just a huge element of luck. And I think if most of us are honest now, maybe it wasn't this way 30 years ago, but now there's just a big element of luck.
Sometimes it feels that you don't even need to be a great historian to get a job, because great historians, they still don't get those jobs. So
No,
luck is an important element.
absolutely.
So now, as a professor,
Yeah.
how do you see your task? What are you going to do for the students and for the PhD students? What is your aspiration?
Well, I
In
mean,
career guiding, not in science, because you
okay,
know that
because
you're a
yeah,
great researcher.
yeah.
You will teach them wonderful things
Of
about.
course, blah, blah, blah. Of course, I want to write several more books. I hope to get a research team. I can go into that. But what I want to do and what I do see is my obligation is to mentor students, PhDs, to try to help them in whatever their goals are. And one part of that also for me, and again, not everyone was happy with my inaugural lecture because I made it very personal and because I was open about these struggles. But I had people coming up to me, the PhDs, masters, almost in tears. And I don't say this to brag, because what I said resonated with them. And I think by telling my story of struggle, and I made it very symbolic and whatever in my lecture of the wilderness and wandering, I hope, no, not everyone's going to luck out like I did and get this professorship, but if there's one thing I can do, well, to help people get where they want to be in academia, but also to know that if they don't, it's not because they weren't good enough. I mean, sure, maybe not everyone's great, but it's not because they weren't good enough. It's because there's very deep structural issues with funding, with financing, with nepotism, with all sorts of implicit, unrecognized bias. There's all sorts of structural issues. So that's also what I think I can do to contribute, is just, hey, it's not necessarily your fault, but also then to help people, especially from different backgrounds, navigate the systems, whether that's cover letters for jobs, whether that's CVs, whether that's, you know, advising to go to this symposium instead of that one, whatever. I mean, I think people have been doing that for a long time. But I want to continue that with the added element of, let's acknowledge that it's really hard.
I thank you very much for this really interesting conversation and for being so open. And I think that we have a lot to learn from you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.